Silver Pines looked like the perfect neighborhood until the FBI crashed an HOA meeting. Flushed face, President Margaret, who ruled with strict fines, was caught stealing over $700,000 of homeowners' money. Luxury cars, vacations, expensive jewelry, all paid for by the very people she was supposed to serve. But it didn't stop there. Fake companies, secret kickbacks, and a network of corrupt board members came to light. Was Margaret just the face of the scam, or was there something even darker behind it all? Trust shattered, community broken, justice finally served. For years, life in the gated community of Silver Pines was neat, almost too neat, sculpted into uniform perfection. Lawns were precise. Fences were measured to the inch. Mailboxes gleamed with uniform paint. Residents lived under the watchful eye of Homeowners Association President Margaret Ellison. She was sharp-tongued, well-dressed, and endlessly proud of her leadership role. On the surface, she kept everything in order. But beneath the manicured grass and glossy newsletters, something was off. Most residents never thought twice about their HOA dues. Payments came quarterly and left their accounts with the subtle sting of inevitability. Everyone assumed the fees maintained the community pool, repainted sidewalks, and funded landscaping projects. But certain details began gnawing at people's suspicion. For instance, the fountain at the entrance hadn't flowed in months, although a repair budget had been approved and taken from dues. The new gym equipment never appeared, even after enthusiastic promises. And strangest of all, Margaret was suddenly flaunting a luxury SUV, expensive jewelry, and a vacation home that she dropped into casual conversation like a prize. It didn't take long for some residents to whisper about where the money was really going. The tipping point arrived during a casual evening barbecue, when neighbors exchanged stories in hushed tones. They realized nothing in the community reflected the hundreds of thousands they had collectively poured into HOA fees. The annual financial report released by Margaret was notoriously vague, filled with maintenance allocations and administrative fees that raised more questions than they answered. Suspicions spread like wildfire. Parents noticed the children's playground equipment was rusting, even though Margaret claimed funding had gone into safety updates. A couple on the west side realized they hadn't seen the contracted lawn company in months, and one of the board treasurers, a quiet, unassuming man named Dennis, began pointing out irregularities. The entries made no sense, from massive withdrawals with no receipts to consulting fees that no one could explain. The deeper residents probed, the more Margaret grew defensive. Anytime someone raised a budget concern, she talked over them, brandishing her authority with phrases like board discretion or confidential funds. Neighbors who pressed too hard mysteriously found HOA violation notices in their mailboxes, whether for unsightly trash bins or unapproved plant choices. It became a weaponized tactic to silence dissent. But not everyone frightened easily. A core group of 8 residents, tired of the evasions, quietly formed a coalition. They studied past budgets, collected every financial statement they could access, and dug into public county records. What they found was staggering. Large checks funneled into shell companies, contractor names that didn't exist, and a bizarre pattern of monthly withdrawals aligned with Margaret's sudden weekend trips abroad. They had stumbled onto something far greater than a few misplaced receipts. This wasn't poor management. This was theft. The coalition realized confronting her directly would be pointless. Margaret thrived on intimidation. She silenced dissent with violation threats, fines, and fear. But this wasn't just about HOA violations anymore. Money had disappeared, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if they were right, all of it had been pocketed by their very own HOA president. A few members of the coalition tried raising the issue in board meetings. Margaret swatted them aside with rehearsed indignation, cutting off their speeches as irrelevant or claiming the financials were beyond homeowner comprehension. She thought she had silenced the whispers, but the stares across the room told a different story. Her grip was slipping. The breaking point came when HOA dues jumped suddenly by 20%, placed under some vague pretense of urgent infrastructure renewal. But there were no new projects scheduled, no visible plans, and the contractors Margaret referenced could not be traced online. For the coalition, that was proof enough. Quietly but deliberately, one resident filed an anonymous complaint with federal authorities. It was no longer just a community dispute. Missing funds on that scale could mean serious crimes. Most of Silver Pines continued on as usual, smiling at block parties and trimming hedges on Saturdays. But beneath the quiet surface, something massive was brewing. Month by month, dollar by dollar, the walls were closing in on Margaret. She didn't know it yet, but the next monthly HOA meeting would change her life forever. The residents were about to discover just how far Margaret had gone to line her pockets. And she was about to discover that even in her carefully tended kingdom of manicured lawns, the law could not be escaped. The pieces were in place. The money trail was undeniable. The whispers had reached too many ears, and the countdown had begun. The uneasy whispers in Silver Pines had grown teeth. By now, the group of 8 homeowners who quietly banded together were meeting after hours, away from Margaret's watchful gaze. They weren't friends before the storm began. Some were casual acquaintances at neighborhood cookouts. Others only knew each other by the quick nod exchanged while pulling out trash bins at night. But united by suspicion, they had become conspirators. Dennis, the treasurer, stood at the heart of their movement. He was the kind of man who paid bills with exact change and kept shoeboxes of receipts in alphabetical folders. When he raised his eyebrows over a ledger, you knew it wasn't paranoia. It was precision. To him, numbers spoke a language of truth, and the numbers screamed theft. Late nights were spent over coffee-stained spreadsheets spread across kitchen tables. Emails were combed line by line, scanned bank transfers scrutinized. They noticed that contractors listed in HOA budgets had no licenses. Consulting services were paid but non-existent. Tens of thousands of dollars shifted to accounts that appeared and then vanished. Nothing more than shadows. Even outside of their secret meetings, Margaret's arrogance fueled suspicion. She strutted through the neighborhood like royalty, parading her designer handbag and polished car. Every accessory an insult to homeowners who were struggling to keep up with climbing dues. Community improvement, she called it. While gutters rusted and the playground sat a hazard to children. Proof was what they needed, cold, undeniable proof. So the coalition began leaving paper trails of their own. They printed duplicate financial records, photographed questionable invoices, and saved screenshots of every electronic banking transfer they could access. Dennis discovered one crucial detail. Every suspicious entry was tied to one of 2 signature approvals, both signed personally by Margaret Ellison. Still, their evidence alone wasn't enough. They knew Margaret's reputation for intimidation. She wielded her position like a weapon. If cornered, she would play victim, accuse the residents of harassment, maybe even launch lawsuits to silence them. For years she had ruled with fear, and now the coalition needed something bigger than numbers on paper. They needed a hammer strong enough to crush her empire of deception. One man in the coalition, a quiet accountant named Samuel, took the boldest step. Instead of whispering, he dialed the anonymous tip line to federal financial crimes. His voice shook at first. After all, this wasn't about a crooked handyman or a broken swing set, but soon stormed with conviction. He described inflated maintenance budgets, fake companies, and funds diverted into shell accounts linked with Margaret herself. And so, for the first time, their whispers left Silver Pines and entered the ears of federal investigators. While the coalition waited, the neighborhood itself seemed to grow restless. Older couples who had once stayed silent began asking questions during HOA meetings. Younger families whispered openly about being bled dry. The air at Margaret's carefully choreographed meetings soured with every passing month. She had run the HOA like a queen controlling her fiefdom, but now her subjects were starting to rebel. Margaret noticed. Her behavior changed. She grew short-tempered, issuing fines at random. A misplaced recycling bin was suddenly unapproved storage. A slightly tall hedge became non-compliant vegetation. The punishments weren't about rules. The punishments were reminders of power. But the tighter she clutched her authority, the more glaring the fractures became. At the grocery store, neighbors turned their backs when she passed. At block parties, laughter fell into silence as she approached. Margaret, who relished her reputation for control, now found herself in the center of suspicion she couldn't smother. Dennis knew the moment of no return had been reached when another financial report landed in his hands. This time it wasn't even subtle. Nearly $50,000 was allocated to an unnamed beautification project. But no such project existed, no workers had been hired, and no plans were filed with the county. It was barefaced theft, laid in black and white. The coalition doubled down. Evidence was bundled tight and sent once again to the federal offices. But they didn't stop there. They spread whispers strategically throughout the neighborhood. They stirred residents into questioning, ensuring that when the fall came, and fall it would, no one would shrug it off as coincidence. They wanted witnesses. They wanted Margaret's empire to crumble in front of all of Silver Pines. Soon they received a subtle message back from investigators. Plain words, politely phrased, stating simply that the case was under review. It wasn't confirmation, but to the coalition, it was enough to ignite hope. The federal machine was slow, methodical, and relentless. And if Margaret had indeed siphoned money from hundreds of homeowners, then her name wouldn't remain untarnished for much longer. To the rest of the community, life carried on. Pool lights flickered broken, landscaping browned, newsletters promised projects that never began. But for the coalition, every day was a countdown. The date circled in red ink across Dennis's calendar wasn't just another Thursday. It was the scheduled monthly HOA meeting. For years, these evenings had been Margaret's theater stage. Her chance to flaunt power, talk over dissent, and enforce silence. But now, whispers of an investigation crept closer. What the residents of Silver Pines didn't know was that this meeting, this seemingly typical gathering of papers, folding chairs, and mandatory attendance, was already marked by winds of justice. Time had run out, and on that night, Silver Pines would no longer be defined by manicured lawns and rigid bylaws. It would be remembered for the sound of the front doors crashing open, the shuffle of heavy boots, and the reveal of everything their president had tried to hide. The evening of the monthly HOA meeting arrived with an air of unease. The community center stood at the edge of Silver Pines, a bland single-story structure with fluorescent lighting and scuffed tile floors, usually fitting for minor disputes about fences and shrub height. Yet tonight, it thrummed with tension. Every folding chair soon filled, not with polite interest, but with a quiet hunger for answers. Margaret Ellison, still polished in her tailored blazer and golden brooch, walked into the room like a monarch addressing peasants. She projected confidence. Her heels clicking sharply, lipstick freshly coated, hair in perfect order. But there was something behind her smile. Perhaps she sensed it already. Perhaps she could feel the silent rebellion pressing in from all around. The coalition sat together near the middle rows, their evidence carefully tucked away but hearts pounding. Outside the building, the night seemed unusually still. Cars were parked haphazardly along the street as dozens of residents gathered within, restless with suspicion. Margaret opened the meeting as always, firm, calculated, self-important. She bragged about ongoing improvements, spoke of budget allocations, and trotted out buzzwords meant to sound official but said absolutely nothing. Yet the audience wasn't the same anymore. They leaned forward, whispering, eyes narrowing. Every vagueness she uttered landed like a brick into a well of distrust. Dennis watched, tight-lipped, as Margaret unfurled her usual theatrics. But time ticked slowly toward the moment he believed was coming, the moment no HOA agenda had ever listed. Halfway through the evening, when Margaret smugly presented inflated budget numbers, the murmurs burst into interruptions. Residents peppered her with questions about missing funds, non-existent projects, and skyrocketing dues. Unlike past meetings, she couldn't silence them anymore. She grew red-faced, snapping that homeowners lacked comprehension of board responsibilities. But the voices only grew louder, a chorus of simmering outrage. And then it happened. The heavy creak of the double doors broke the room's rhythm. Every head turned at once. In marched black-clad figures, their presence instant and undeniable. Federal agents. Badges glinted under harsh fluorescent lights. The air shifted sharply from argument to stunned silence. They didn't pause at the doorway. They moved as if rehearsed, scanning the space, pulling forward into rows of stunned homeowners. The lead agent leveled his gaze toward the podium where Margaret stood frozen, hands clutching the wooden edges like a lifeline. The very room she had controlled for years had just become her stage of downfall. The residents' disbelief melted into shock, then into a flurry of camera phones raised high. Neighbors murmured, whispering as agents crossed the tiled floor with unflinching precision. Margaret tried to speak, her words tumbling out in an incoherent mixture of excuses and indignation. But her control had vanished the moment the agents arrived. One stepped forward, producing paperwork that bore the seal she couldn't fight. A federal warrant. It was for financial fraud and embezzlement. Dozens of eyes read phrases like misappropriation of funds, fraudulent transactions, and misuse of HOA dues. What had been whispered for months was now written with authority, confirmed by the weight of law. Cameras recorded as Margaret's face drained of color. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, she had no defense, no violation slips to issue, no rules to twist. The agents instructed her to step forward. Instead, she stammered, reaching for her stack of papers like they might shield her. She muttered about misunderstandings, about misrecorded numbers, about political attacks. But no one, absolutely no one, believed her. And then came the sight the residents of Silver Pines would never forget. Margaret Ellison, the untouchable queen of fines and violations, placed in cuffs before the very homeowners she had bullied for years. Her brooch gleamed one last time under harsh lights before it tilted awkwardly as her hands were pulled back. A hush filled the room, broken only by the scrape of chair legs as people stood, straining to watch. Margaret snapped at the agents, her voice sharp yet panicked, warning that they'd regret this, warning that she controlled more than they understood. But her threats carried no weight anymore. The steel bracelets on her wrists clinked with finality. Phones filmed every second. Some residents mouthed gasps, others clapped softly, while the coalition sat unblinking, consumed by vindication. For them, months of quiet paranoia had surged into reality. Their proof, their suspicions, everything was validated in one thunderous moment of justice. As the agents guided her toward the doors, Margaret turned her head, flashing glares of venom and disbelief. She had imagined herself untouchable, yet here she was, marched out like any other criminal, past neighbors she once fined for weeds, escorted into the night by strangers wearing federal badges. And just like that, the iron rule of Margaret Ellison collapsed in a single evening. But her arrest wasn't the end. It was only the dramatic midpoint of something deeper, because as the crowd buzzed with excitement, agents left behind an unnerving message. The investigation was larger than they imagined. It extended beyond Margaret herself, into hidden companies, bank accounts stretching across state lines, and possible accomplices within or outside the community. For Silver Pines, the sight of their president in handcuffs was both closure and beginning. Closure of tyranny, beginning of exposure. The room remained electric long after the agents vanished beyond the doors. Neighbors spoke in bursts, disbelief mixing with joy. The oppressive fear Margaret had fostered evaporated instantly. Yet for the coalition, relief carried suspicion still. They didn't know how deep her collusion ran. They didn't know who else had dirt under their fingernails. And as the hum of conversation filled the community hall, one thought united them all. If Margaret had the audacity to steal directly under their noses for years, what else had been hidden just out of sight? The answers would come in time. But not all answers bring peace. Some tear open wounds wider than before. The night Margaret Ellison was taken away in handcuffs hung in everyone's memory like a scar. Neighbors left the community building in clusters, their voices tight with disbelief, their steps quickened by jittery excitement. What they had witnessed was the collapse of the very foundation Silver Pines had been built upon. For years, Margaret's presence was untouchable, her rules absolute. Yet in a moment, she was reduced to another name etched into a thick federal case file. But justice didn't close there. If anything, the arrest was only the beginning of something far more complicated. In the days that followed, Silver Pines buzzed like a hornet's nest shaken from its branch. Videos of the meeting, captured by multiple residents, spread across social media faster than wildfire. The sight of Margaret, polished blazer, golden brooch, wrists in handcuffs, circulated beyond the gates of Silver Pines. Strangers online labeled her the HOA crook. Comment sections exploded with outrage, stories of other corrupt HOAs, even dark humor at her expense. For the coalition that had uncovered her crimes, vindication was tempered with unease. Because soon, letters appeared in every resident's mailbox. Federal investigators had formally opened a case into HOA-related financial misconduct. They requested cooperation and warned that multiple years of missing money were under review. The homeowners learned the staggering truth piece by piece. Margaret hadn't simply siphoned off a few extra thousand from landscaping budgets. It was far deeper. Over 5 years of presidency, she had orchestrated what investigators called a systematic embezzlement scheme. Entire dues collections had been funneled into accounts she either controlled directly or through shell corporations registered to false names. The Fountain Project? Never funded. The clubhouse renovations? Non-existent. The lawn contracts? Forged signatures. Worse still, evidence suggested she hadn't worked alone. Her treasurer, Dennis, once careful and meticulous, became a focus point for investigators. He swore he had nothing to do with Margaret's diversions, and truthfully, his obsessive nature seemed the very thing that exposed her. But investigators discovered that multiple board members over the years had looked the other way, approving checks without proper oversight. Some may have been complicit, others simply reckless. What was undeniable was this: Margaret had relied on negligence as much as deception. For the neighborhood, trust disintegrated overnight. Friends who once exchanged gardening tips glared now with suspicion. Anyone who served on the board during Margaret's reign was painted with doubt. Some swore they saw them as accomplices. Others argued they had been manipulated. Regardless, the fractures in community bonds widened fast. Meanwhile, Margaret's assets became public spectacle. News stories revealed her SUV had been purchased almost entirely with HOA funds. Her lavish vacations, her beach property in another state, even the expensive brooch pinned at her collar the night of her arrest, all funded by the very checks her neighbors had written. While sidewalks crumbled, she drank wine under neon city lights. While kids sliced their hands on rusting playground slides, she enjoyed high-rise spas. Investigators froze her accounts, seized the SUV, and began the long process of tracing stolen money. The HOA, left temporarily leaderless, faced chaos. Without leadership, without financial access, and without community trust, Silver Pines sat adrift. Notices online called special meetings to rebuild the board. The same residents who had once feared Margaret's violation fines stepped forward now to fill the vacuum, determined not to let corruption root itself again. But here's what chilled everyone most. The full sum stolen was staggering. Not tens of thousands. Not even hundreds of thousands. Over $700,000 had vanished, drawn carefully in increments, diverted year after year under the quiet claim of community enrichment. And though the FBI worked methodically, rumors flourished in a vacuum. Some said Margaret had connections beyond Silver Pines, that shell accounts tied her to out-of-state relatives, maybe even partners she hadn't named. Others whispered she would cut deals, reveal accomplices in exchange for leniency. For the coalition, victory tasted bittersweet. Margaret was caught, yes, but the damage she left behind lingered like rot. Their neighborhood, once polished and proud, was suddenly infamous online as the $1 million HOA scandal. Potential buyers pulled out of sales. Property values dipped. Every conversation became about fines, missing money, and lawsuits. Children still played, sprinklers still ran, but the invisible shadow of corruption loomed. Silver Pines was stained. One neighbor, a soft-spoken widow named Irene, captured the conflicted feeling best when she said during an impromptu gathering, "We spent years thinking cracks in sidewalks were our biggest problems, but the cracks were under our feet the whole time, in the very foundation of who we trusted." And as the weeks passed, Homeowners realized the nightmare wasn't simply Margaret being escorted away in handcuffs. It was the long trail of deceit she left behind, paperwork riddled with lies, bills unpaid, and trust shattered. The FBI dug through it all. And with each new disclosure, people realized they only saw the tip of the iceberg. Because Margaret's arrest was dramatic, but her scheme, it stretched into shadows they hadn't anticipated. Shadows where other names, other hands may have been pulling strings. The question lingered in Silver Pines. Was Margaret the queen of corruption, or just the face of something larger? Silver Pines thought the nightmare might calm once Margaret Ellison was in custody. Neighbors imagined life returning to block parties, neat flower beds, and trivial debates about mailbox colors. But the aftermath proved far uglier. Because as investigators clawed deeper through Margaret's records, they realized her theft was not an isolated act. It was part of a sprawling, carefully layered deception that touched nearly every corner of the HOA. The FBI focused on the board's financial history, pulling statements from prior years, examining contracts, and interviewing residents. What they uncovered seared through the fragile peace of the neighborhood. Multiple board members across different terms were connected to Margaret's scheme. Some played passive roles, deliberately ignoring inconsistencies for their own slice of convenience. Others may have directly profited. The rot was not a single leader's greed. It was the HOA itself, twisted into a personal bank. Contractors listed for landscaping and security improvements were phantom businesses. At times nothing more than P.O. boxes registered under relatives of board members. Payments meant for community upgrades were funneled into these shells. But even more sinister than fake companies were the revelations of deliberate kickbacks. Investigators found proof that certain residents, neighbors still quietly attending meetings, accepted payoffs in exchange for silence during budgets. A pool of greed that sickened the community to its core. The coalition that first uncovered Margaret's fraud struggled with the weight of each new revelation. They had worked tirelessly, uncovering breadcrumbs that pointed primarily to Margaret herself. Now the crumbs led deeper, twisting into tunnels across the neighborhood, implicating names they once trusted. The dry cleaner down the street, his wife, a former board secretary, had forged documentation for fake printing costs. A tech consultant who lived in the West Houses, he was listed as the IT specialist for fabricated HOA cyber systems that never existed, pocketing a slice of the pie. Even the former vice president, who resigned quietly 2 years earlier citing health reasons, turned out to have received tens of thousands funneled to her son's sham landscaping company. News spilled like poison through group chats, neighborhood forums, and whispered driveway conversations. Did you hear about so-and-so? How could they do that to us? All those dues we struggled to pay gone. Every corner of the community stung with betrayal. And that betrayal went beyond the money itself. Silver Pines was supposed to be a place of order, where dues were justified as protecting property values, where rules kept one lawn as pretty as the next. But in truth, the HOA had masked years of theft under the guise of maintaining perfection. Neighbors realized they weren't paying for flowers or fountain repairs. They were funding corruption written into their very bylaws. The full scope frightened even seasoned agents. Records suggested upwards of $1 million siphoned over a decade, shuffled through layers of signatures and stamped approvals. Margaret had been the figurehead, but the board itself had been the machinery. Residents responded in waves of anger. Emergency neighborhood meetings were called in living rooms, free from the stained HOA structure. People shouted about suing former board members, about destroying the HOA entirely. Some pressed for restitution, believing if assets were seized, money would return. Others grew cynical, realizing they might never recover what was lost. The community unity Margaret once shattered grew into something new now, a raw self-awareness. Neighbors began to bond over anger, poring collectively over files released by investigators, piecing together how deep the scam ran. Curiosity turned into obsession. Someone even pinned a corkboard in the clubhouse lobby, plastered with printouts of old budgets. Red circles marking every fake entry. It looked more like a crime scene evidence board than a neighborhood space. And as word spread further, Silver Pines became infamous. Local news crews parked vans outside gates, asking shocked residents for sound bites. Headlines branded it the $1 million HOA heist. Nationwide, homeowners in other neighborhoods muttered with newfound paranoia, realizing that if corruption could burrow this deep into Silver Pines, it could happen anywhere. Yet, in the chaos, another detail unsettled the community. Margaret, when first arrested, had made strange comments. She warned investigators they'd regret this, that they didn't know everyone involved. At the time, people dismissed it as her final act of arrogance. But now, with accomplices identified and old board members facing investigation, residents began to wonder if she had been right. Whispers floated that she wasn't the mastermind at all, that there may have been someone else, a quieter puppet master guiding the scams while Margaret absorbed glory and risk. What frightened them wasn't what they already knew, but what still hid in shadows. Was Margaret truly the root of the rot, or only the most visible branch cut down first? The coalition, bruised but determined, resolved to see it through. They dug deeper alongside investigators, unwilling to let their neighborhood drown in suspicion alone. But with every new discovery, the truth became less comforting and more grotesque. Silver Pines wasn't diseased in one spot. It had rotted through the trunk, leaving no part of leadership pure. And as the days stretched toward Margaret's looming trial, another reality arose. This wasn't just cleanup anymore. For Silver Pines, this was survival. Because what investigators found next would shake not just their neighborhood, but the entire state's view of HOAs to the core. Months after the night the FBI stormed into Silver Pines, the case against Margaret Ellison stood like a mountain of paperwork, each document a chisel carved against her carefully curated image. Federal prosecutors built their arsenal brick by brick. Bank statements, forged contracts, shell company registries, false vendor payments, luxury purchases tied directly to HOA funds, and testimonies from residents who had lived under her reign. The trial began in a stately courthouse downtown, far from the manicured lawns Margaret so loved to parade through. For the residents of Silver Pines, it was pilgrimage. Carpools carried neighbors into town, where they packed public seating, eager to watch the downfall of a woman who once controlled everything from their paint colors to their mailbox heights. The prosecution painted Margaret as more than careless. She was methodical, ruthless, and deceitful. They described her as an illusionist who wore the mask of community leadership, while secretly bleeding that community dry. Charts displayed giant pools of missing funds. Witnesses described threats, fines, intimidation used to silence anyone who felt brave enough to ask, "Why is the fountain still broken?" Margaret sat at the defense table, still immaculate in appearance but diminished by the sterile lighting. For every polished blazer, there were uncuffed wrists no longer adorned with her signature brooch, but instead restrained by legal counsel at either side. Her lawyers argued desperation, claimed misunderstandings, tried to frame her as someone who had been swept along by others, coerced by pressures she couldn't control. They claimed the shell companies were mistakes, left unchecked, tried to pin blame on administrative confusion and on subordinate board members. But the narrative collapsed under evidence. Screen after screen of transfers bore her signature. Witness after witness described the endless fines, the smug dismissal of concerns, the intimidation tactics that fueled her reign. And then the true hammer fell, when evidence emerged of accomplices. A former board vice president testified under oath, revealing how Margaret pressured him to approve false budgets in exchange for payoff. Another revealed she wasn't just reckless but knew exactly what she was doing, once bragging during a private dinner. "They'll never question me. I am Silver Pines." The irony of that claim, flashed on courtroom screens in emails prosecutors subpoenaed, was not lost on the jury. Inside Silver Pines, news of the trial spread daily. Residents gathered in driveways, following media reports like it was a neighborhood sports event. Except this wasn't a game. This was their future. Property values remained cratered. The HOA's name became a national punchline. While children rode bikes past cracked pavement, their parents whispered about restitution hearings and possible class action suits against former leaders. The coalition, once just a group of suspicious neighbors huddled over bills, found themselves hailed in media stories as whistleblowing heroes. Without their persistence, without their months of quiet resistance in Margaret's shadow, the theft might have continued unchecked for years. And at last, the verdict. The jury returned swiftly, guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of financial records, and conspiracy. Margaret's face, once smug and vibrant, cracked under the weight of words that echoed sharp through the courtroom. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The judge delivered the sentence with gravity. Nearly 20 years in federal prison and restitution orders exceeding $500,000, with seized assets, including her beach home and SUV, redirected toward partial repayment. Gasps, then tears of relief, swept through Silver Pines residents in attendance. Margaret Ellison, the queen of bylaws and fines, the tyrant of lawns and fountains, was no longer untouchable. She was just another inmate with a number. The accomplices, too, faced consequences. Some took plea deals, others awaited sentencing for aiding her deception. The rot in Silver Pines had been dug out, but at great cost. Back within the gates of the community, reconstruction began. A new board formed, this time stripped down to transparent practices. Neighbors discarded the glossy community newsletters for open discussions. Budgets were displayed publicly with receipts attached. The fountain was repaired, not for show, but as a symbol that the neighborhood wasn't broken forever. Yet Silver Pines never returned to what it once was. Trust, once shattered, could not be patched like sidewalks. Residents spoke openly now, no longer afraid, but quieter, warier. The HOA, once a weapon of control, was just another reminder of what unchecked power could become. In living rooms and backyard conversations, they often returned to the same thought. How had it gone on for so long? How could neighbors laugh at block parties while hundreds of thousands drained away in silence? And how much stronger were Margaret's chains than anyone realized? The coalition, now just neighbors once again, held on to one bittersweet reality. They had toppled the tyrant, but trust would take generations to heal. Still, there was a strange relief in all of it. Kids could swing safely at the playground again. Couples could enjoy weekends without violation letters arriving mysteriously in the mail. And every time someone passed the once intimidating community hall, they smiled at the memory, not of fear, but of justice marching through its double doors. Because Silver Pines would forever carry a story not of perfection, but of downfall and redemption. A story whispered in other neighborhoods when HOA whispers turned sour. A warning that beneath every manicured lawn and neatly painted mailbox, shadows might lurk. The residents of Silver Pines lived under tyranny, survived scandal, and rebuilt from ashes. And though Margaret Ellison once declared she was Silver Pines, the truth became clear in the end. She was never the beating heart of the community. She was nothing more than a parasite. The true strength of Silver Pines lay in the neighbors who refused to bow.